Well, Steve, thanks so much for having me tonight, and for everybody else to put up with me speaking to you tonight. As Steve said, it's 10:30 here. This is way past my bedtime. I have a tour in the morning too that I have to lead, so this is going to be, if all of a sudden I stop talking and you hear this like snoring in the background, just someone say something really loud and I'll wake up. Okay. So yeah, this is a little bit late for me, but what I'm going to try to do here tonight is I'm going to start out with a short video if it works. Technology is great when it works, and we're going to give it a try, and hopefully you'll hear the sound and everything else. And then once the video's over, I'll get into my formal presentation, if you want to call it that. I don't like to do too formal things, but we'll keep this as laid back as possible. But let me see if I can share my screen here and do a video. Let's see if it'll work here. Like I said, it might take a second. You got to go through. Where is it? Why? Oh, this is a good start, right? There we go. So let's try this. Okay, did that work? Could everybody see that? Oh, awesome. Well, good. Thanks for indulging me there with that. It's something I like to do when I start my presentations to hopefully convince people, if they're not already, that I am a bird photographer. I'm not pretending. So anyway, so from this point on, I'm going to get into my talk. And I'll share my screen again here. Let's see. Let's get out of this. Back to basic. And you know what? There we go. So hopefully you all can see that. All of a sudden, I need to. All right. So, as Steve had pointed out, my talk tonight is going to be tech event. Can you all see the screen? Can you all see the slide presentation? Great. It's going to be talking about tech advancements, and all those pictures you saw in that video, that has nothing to do with talent on my part. It all has to do with technology. The cameras being so good now, and autofocus being so good now, that it allows you to get images like you saw there a lot easier. It still takes practice. It still takes some talent these days to do that. So I'm more joking than anything else. But I want to talk about tech advancements and in the realm of birds in flight, bird photography in general, but birds in flight specifically. And I want to talk about good things about these tech advancements, bad things, and at the very end, I want to talk about one ugly thing about these tech advancements. So let's see if we can move forward here. For some reason, it's not letting me do it. There we go. We can do it in one way or another. So there's 4 different aspects to this that I want to talk about. One is the camera bodies themselves, and more specifically, the sensors and the processors in those camera bodies that we're talking about. And a lot of these advancements have come really, really recently. Mirrorless cameras have brought on a lot of these advancements. And so I want to talk about the bodies and sensors and processors. I want to talk about autofocus. It's another specific aspect of this. Image stabilization, both IBIS and in-lens stabilization, because we have 2 different things now, and that's one of the advancements of recent years. And then post-processing, and I have an AI after that, artificial intelligence, because that's a big part of what post-processing digital images has become. First, sensors, processors, and post-processing or artificial intelligence. The good things, right? Let's talk about the good things first. High resolution now. We're getting higher and higher resolution on these sensors and these cameras, 45 plus megapixels, 50, 60. It's really come on in recent years, these high resolution sensors. High frames per second now. The frame rate that you can take still images now is video. It's like video, 30 frames per second. I just got my R3 and I went out shooting with it for the first time this morning. I can shoot 30 frames per second now. That's video, okay? That's a video rate. So we're going to talk about that. The ISO performance of these sensors now is amazing. I can remember when I wouldn't shoot over ISO 800 on my 50D, Canon 50D or something like that. Now we're shooting at ISO 4000, even higher. We'll talk about that. Oops, hold on. We went too far there. Post-processing, we'll get to that kind of toward the end. And it has to do with what you can do now, even though we have all these great advancements, these good things that I just mentioned, post-processing is still a huge part of digital photography, especially birds in flight, everything else. So we'll talk about that. So as far as high resolution goes and frames per second, we'll take those two things kind of together. For the first time, for me anyway, just recently, I've been able to get at what us, if everybody here is interested in bird photography and birds in flight, and I expect you are, or you wouldn't be here this evening, it's for the first time you can have one camera body that can do both. You can shoot high resolution and high frames per second. And in bird and flight photography, high frames per second is really important because action happens quickly. Things, that bird may glance at you for a split second when it's flying by, or activities happening where an osprey's coming down and diving. It's only for a split second that their talons are out right in front and things like that, and their eyes are open, their nictitating membranes haven't closed yet. So that frames per second helps you capture that instant that you're really looking for at a much higher rate or a higher probability of getting that instant. So before, if you wanted the high frame rate, you had to sacrifice resolution. And as we know, a lot of bird species aren't very big. Okay, they're not very large. So, to have high frame rate and you're shooting 12 megapixels, well, us as bird photography, you have to crop. It's, cropping, where you to try to make the composition you want. Bird big enough in the frame to make an interesting composition. That was tough. When you only had 12 megapixels. Now you can shoot high frame rates and have high resolution, like I mentioned, 45 megapixels plus now. The Canon R5 is 45 megapixels, the Sony A1 is 50, the Z9 coming out now is going to be 47 or 45, something like that. So all three major manufacturers of cameras are coming out with high frame rate, high resolution cameras. This is a new thing. And it's a great thing for bird and flight photography. I used to always have to carry two cameras, now just one if I want to. I carry two R5s with me now. First time I've ever been able to shoot with two of the same camera. And that's a great thing, right? You don't want to be going, how many times have you gone, you grab a different camera, even if it's by the same manufacturer, both Canon, I'm a Canon shooter, but this applies to any manufacturer. And things are a little different. Right. And muscle memory is really important when it comes to birds in flight because things happen quickly, like I already mentioned. So it's nice to be able to grab two of the, switching bodies. Now they're exactly the same. I haven't set up the same, obviously. So it's a great thing. And for the first time, we can do that as bird and flight photographers. The other thing I want to mention here is about ISO performance and how that adds into this. In that we used to have to shoot 600. I still have my 600 f4 Canon. I love it, but it's a Mark II version. It weighs 9 pounds. It's heavy. It's big. And you did that because you needed the speed. Low light sometimes. You're in rainforests. Not so much for birds in flight a lot of times, but light isn't always the best. When you're shooting, you need high shutter speeds, right? For birds in flight, a lot of times. And in order to get that, you needed these big aperture fast lenses. And in order to keep your ISOs down, so your noise wouldn't get unbelievably bad, trying to shoot these higher shutter speeds. Now with ISO performance where they are, I mentioned already, I'll shoot as high as ISO 4000 or even higher now. We've got the ability to shoot smaller, lighter lenses. They're still 500 millimeters, 600 millimeters, but they don't have to be f4. Okay, they can be the Canon 100 to 500 at 500 millimeters is f7.1. It's much smaller, much lighter, much easier to carry around, much easier to be quick with for birds in flight, things like that. So this good ISO performance that we have now in these sensors and these cameras really helps with birds in flight. Talk quickly about post-processing here, and this lends to a lot of the same things I've been talking about here, is that the ability to remove noise from images, to sharpen your images, has changed relatively recently. There are these software manufacturers like Topaz, I'll just use them as an example, but DxO comes in there, all that. They're using artificial intelligence type algorithms now. And before, when you were post-processing your images and you were removing noise, or especially if you were sharpening your bird or something like that, generally you didn't sharpen your entire image. That's the way I looked at it anyway. If you had a bird, a subject in your image, you only wanted to sharpen the bird. You didn't want to sharpen the background because you had all, there's noise in the background. And if you sharpen the background of your image, you're just going to enhance that noise. So you didn't want to do that. So you had to take all this time to select the bird. And sometimes that was easy. And sometimes, though, if you had a background that was detailed, that could be a time-consuming process to separate those two out. So you could do the noise reduction on the background and sharpening on your subject, the bird. Well, now with these artificial intelligence type driven software programs for doing these things like Topaz Denoise and Topaz Sharpen, that's what I use the most. So I'm going to use them as an example. It does almost all of that masking, all of that selection for you, and it does a really great job at it. And so it just is amazingly so much quicker and so much more accurate than you almost used to be able to do by hand. Not only that, but like the sharpening of the bird, it used to be in these older programs, it would just look for edge contrast on the feathers of your bird, and it would enhance that contrast. So it's kind of like artificially enhancing the sharpness, making it look sharper, but it wasn't really sharpening the image. Topaz Sharpen and Denoise now, they're not doing that. They're doing something different now. They're actually realigning pixels of your image. They're analyzing your entire image, and if you select one of the algorithms for, say, motion blur or something like that, it's actually calculating where the different pixels should have been if there would have been no image blur or motion blur in that bird, and realigning the pixels. This is true sharpening now. This was never available before. So it's really come a long ways as far as post-processing. So with sensors and processors and post-processing, we've got, I don't know how much better this kind of stuff can get. I really find after shooting just about every Canon digital camera that has come out, starting at 8 megapixels, going all the way up now to 45 megapixels, that 45 megapixels is a great sweet spot for birds and bird and flight photography. You get the detail that you want. It allows you to crop in a little bit. I think right now, when it comes to sensors and processors, I keep saying I just don't know how much further technology can go with this stuff, but it keeps moving forward, right? It keeps moving, but this is a lot of good, there's a lot of good stuff here. So now let's talk a little bit about the bad that comes along with this advancement with the sensors and processors and things like that. Resolution. I just said that, and it works both ways. I just said that the resolution, these high resolutions, allow you to crop in more on your images. We as bird photographers, small subjects a lot of times, yes. But I see some of my clients, they're changing their overall thinking, their overall philosophy when they're going out to do birds in flight, bird photography in general. They're starting to think now that, well, now I don't even have to worry about getting the bird big in the frame. I can just rely on cropping in to get the compositions I want. Yes, you can, more than you ever could before. But do I recommend that as a philosophy? Is that the mindset you should have when you go out to do birds in flight, bird photography? I say no. Before, like I said, you couldn't crop so much. So you had to try to get closer to your subjects. You wanted them composed in the field as best as you could, how you wanted your final image to come out. And you did what you needed to within respect to the birds and stuff, getting close to these subjects and stuff like that. I say continue with that thinking. don't let the high resolutions lull you into thinking that you can have this little pinprick of a bird in a frame and zoom all the way in on that bird. And in a cropping situation in post-processing, and you're going to have as good an image as you could have had. Just think about if that bird would have been in the frame, in camera, as big as you wanted it, or close anyway, in your final composition. All those awesome 45 megapixels of resolution, most of those pixels on your bird, right? That is one of the great things about this, is that you can now get resolution and detail on your birds like you never could before. So I would say, don't change your philosophy when you're out there trying to do birds in flight or birds in general, because you have higher resolution. One of the bad things that comes along with 45 megapixels and 30 frames per second, I went out, like I said, this morning for the first time with my R3. I took 6,500 images in 2 hours. That is a heap load of data. Okay, you're filling cards up. You know, I filled up a 256 gigabyte compact flash express card in a couple hours messing around. And when you get home, you have to deal with all of that data. You have to go through all of those images. You have to store, hopefully not all of those images. Some of my clients, they're not able to throw an image away. You know, you can throw images away, and now you almost have to, because you're generating a ton of data. And so you have to be somewhat, you have to be more prudent in how you go through your images and picking the ones you want, or you're going to buy a bunch of hard drives. Dealing with a 45 megapixel raw image can be difficult on your computer, depending on what kind of computer you have. It can take some time to do some of these processes that you might want to do with your image, such as topaz sharpen and things. I know some folks that say it takes, you know, a long 10 minutes to do a sharpening on a big image like this. I have a computer that I built personally for video work and for post-processing still images, so mine doesn't take that long. But this is something else that you have to think about now. It could be a bad thing for some people, because they may not have the resources to deal with all of this data, all these data that are coming to them with 6,000 images. It's great in one way, but that's one of the drawbacks, is all of the data that you generate. A heavy hand, what I mean by this, and this is the post-processing part of it, because of the software packages that are out there now for post-processing, you've got a situation where a lot more people are trying to do a lot more with post-processing. And I see a lot of images. My clients send me images all the time saying, I know this can look better than it does. Can you help me post-process? I'm having trouble with it. And I see these images, and they're trying to do way too much with their images. So having the opportunity to work with your images in ways that you never could before is a great thing overall. But be careful. My philosophy in working with my images in post-processing and using things like topaz, denoise, or sharpen is to take a light hand with it. Always think about doing the minimum to make the image look good. If you have to start doing a whole bunch of stuff to your image, a lot of sharpening or a lot of denoising, and say, you know, that's probably not a good thing. So your image probably isn't going to turn out looking quite the way you'd like it to. And so I always recommend take a light hand. If an image takes a ton of work, unless it's an image that is just so rare, so unique, or so important to you, maybe it's better to go out and try to get a better image than to work an image to death in post-processing. So that's the bad part of you know, where we are with sensors, processors, and artificial intelligence. We can move on to the next subject here, and this is about autofocus. We'll start out, as we did before, with the good parts of this. There's just been amazing advancements in autofocus recently. I mean, within the last few years, and it just keeps getting better and better. Is autofocus and these the advancements in autofocus, the most important things for bird, the most important advancement for bird and flight photography. I'll talk about that. And then talk about a paradigm shift when it comes to how autofocus works. So these are good things again. And so the thing about autofocus now, it wasn't but a few years ago when I was shooting a Canon 1DX Mark II, as an example, where when I went out to do birds in flight, which I do 90% of my photography of birds is, well, in flight photography, it was my job to keep one little center autofocus point on that bird, to get the bird in focus, keep it on that bird, whatever it's doing, in order to shoot birds in flight and get sharp images as far as autofocus is concerned. Now, when I'm going out and shooting with my R5, the R3 now, or if you're shooting with a Sony A9 II or a Sony A1, or pretty soon you're going to be shooting with a Nikon Z9, something like that, you don't have to do that anymore. These autofocus systems will track not only the bird, but it'll track the bird's body across the frame. It'll track the bird, it'll track the bird's head. It'll track the bird's eye. That fine detail now across the frame within whatever zone you tell it to. That is an unbelievable change in autofocus, and it works. It really works. And so as far as birds in flight goes, this has completely changed how hard or easy, depending on how you look at it, is to do bird in flight photography. I have clients that have struggled for many years to get a lot of high proportion of keeper shots doing birds in flight, with the old technique of having just to have to keep an autofocus point on the bird as you're panning with it, tracking with it, however you want to put it. Now with these new autofocus systems, they are getting images that they only dreamed of getting before. And so these systems are just amazing, the advancements that have happened. I thought the R5's autofocus system was just unbelievable. I shot, like I said, with the R3 for the first time this morning for about 2.5 hours. It is, believe it or not, better. And it is actually quite a bit better. I can't imagine what the R1 is going to be like. That's going to be Canon's flagship model, and that's probably going to come out in a year and a half. I just can't imagine. It's just amazing what autofocus systems will do for you now. Is it the most important thing for bird in flight? The most important advancement that's come along? I'd say yes. It really, I just gave you the example of people being able to get images that they've never been able to get before. It is just incredible what these things can do now. The paradigm shift I'm talking about, RTC, stands for real-time composition. How many of you, when you shoot birds in flight, are thinking about composing the image actually in real time as you're shooting the bird as it goes by, or as you're tracking it in the frame? That was really hard to do before. Like I said, you had a fixed autofocus point that wasn't going anywhere in the frame, mostly in the center, maybe off a little bit. You would move it up and down if the bird's wings were going to be up a lot or down a lot, you'd reposition that one autofocus point, but it stayed where you put it while you were shooting the bird in flight. So you really couldn't actively compose your images because you had to keep that autofocus point on the bird. Now you don't have a static autofocus point anymore. I don't even know if you can call it that you have an autofocus. You have an autofocus that is tracking your bird, not only your bird, maybe your bird's head and even the bird's eye as it's flying. Now you can actually start moving the bird back in the frame, leaving more room out in front, the direction the bird's flying. You can start, when I shoot my Canon R5 and now my R3, once I see that autofocus point grab that bird's head, or once I see the, I'm still have to change the terminology I use. When I see the Canon R5 or R3's autofocus put a box around the bird's head or its eye, saying it's on it, it's got it, it's focused on it, and it's tracking it, I don't even look at that little box anymore. I'm now looking at the bird in the frame, where it is in my frame, and I'm trying to actively compose these images in real time as I'm shooting these birds in flight now. That is a paradigm shift in how I shoot birds in flight. I'll use an example that's not really a bird in flight example, but it's an action bird image. We have reddish egrets here in Florida, and the way they forage is they dance around in the water that's maybe this deep, and they put their wings out and they stab at fish as they go around, and they grab fish and shrimp and things like that as they're going. Before, if you wanted to make sure that their head was in focus, you had to keep that one autofocus point on that bird's head. So you're shooting, you're doing this with the bird's head, trying to keep it in focus. Now the autofocus follows the bird's head up and down as it's stabbing at fish and jumping around. All I'm doing is trying to keep the bird in the frame, framed well in the frame. The autofocus is following that bird's eye up and down, into the water, out, in, out, in, out, in, out. Paradigm shift in how I think about how I shoot active bird photography now, including birds in flight. So some unbelievably good things have happened with autofocus. Of course, there are some bad things, right? When I first started shooting my R5 2 years ago now, maybe almost, I think, came out, that autofocus box tracking the bird around, my brain was so used to, like I have already mentioned, the autofocus point being static in the frame near the center. My brain was still thinking that way, even though that wasn't the case anymore. When I'm looking through the R5 and that box is on that bird's head, it can wander all over the frame. What I'm seeing is, and this wasn't just me, but a lot of my clients were saying the same thing. They were losing their frame of reference of where the bird was when they were shooting. They get home and all of a sudden their bird is way up in the upper right-hand corner, and they had no idea because they're following that box around with their eye, trying to keep the box on the bird when they don't need to keep the box on the bird anymore, the autofocus point, whatever you want to call it, because it's following the bird's eye or head, but they're still thinking that that's in the center of the frame or near it all the time. So it was really easy. It's really easy with these tracking type autofocus systems to lose your reference of where you are, where you're composing the bird in the frame, until you completely change how you start to think, that paradigm shift. Don't look at the box anymore or the autofocus point and try to keep it on the bird. Put the bird in the frame where you want it. On the R5, what I did is I shoot totally manual exposure. So my meter does nothing to my exposure settings. So I put the Canon R5 in spot metering mode because that puts a circle, a faint circle right in the center of the frame that doesn't move. That's now my frame of reference. So anyway, one of the bad things about this tracking autofocus is it's really easy to lose your frame of reference of where your bird is in the frame. Lazy, question mark. Does it make you lazy, these autofocus systems now? And what I mean by lazy is, before it was inherent in how you shot birds in flight. Like I've already said a couple times, you have one center autofocus point or a few of them active, and they're static. So in order to keep that on your flying bird, you had to be panning at close to the same speed, rate, whatever you want to call it, as your bird in flight. That's really important to getting really tack sharp bird in flight images. Now, because that point moves around with the bird, you don't have to necessarily pan so accurately with your bird for the autofocus point to stay on the bird, or the autofocus to stay on the bird and keep it in focus. So what I'm seeing is people are going to get lazy in their panning abilities. Bird's going to be all over the place in the frame, and the autofocus is following it. It's because the person's not doing a good job. The photographer's not doing a good job of keeping it steady and panning accurately with the bird. That can be a problem, especially if you're not shooting at high shutter speeds. I like to shoot some of my bird in flight images at slower shutter speeds on purpose. And sometimes you just have to shoot it at slow shutter speeds or slower shutter speeds because you don't have enough light. So we're not always shooting at 1/8,000th of a second. By the way, with the Canon R3, you can now shoot at 1/12,000th of a second if you want, stuff like that. So that's just an aside. But a lot of times we can't shoot at high shutter speeds, which are a great asset for bird in flight, any other action photography, because it gives you that fudge factor for if you're not panning quite at the speed of the bird. You don't have to be. If you're shooting at high shutter speeds, it'll stop that motion blur. But if you have to shoot at slower shutter speeds, or if you purposely shoot at slower shutter speeds, and you're now getting lazy because you see that autofocus tracking the bird, and you're not tracking at the speed that the bird is flying or close to it, you're going to end up with some soft shots. And it's because you're getting lazy. You're letting the autofocus try to do the work, when the autofocus's job isn't to stop that bird and make it sharp. It's to get autofocus. It's to get focus, to get the bird in focus. So don't get lazy because now the autofocus is able to track the bird and help you. If you just have your camera on a tripod and you're not panning at all, and that bird flies through your frame and you're firing off at 1/8,000th of a second, you may actually get a sharp, if it happens to hit right in the center there or in the frame, the bird does, it might be sharp. You do that at 1/1000th of a second, that bird isn't going to be sharp. You've got to still, even though the autofocus grabbed it, right? You still have to pan accurately with your subjects when you're doing bird in flight photography to get tack sharp images. I'm going to move along to a couple. Now it matters. Things matter now with autofocus. They always did matter, but they really matter now. And what I mean by that is your settings inside your cameras, on your lenses, however it works, whatever system you're using. In the past, autofocus systems in a Canon camera had options that you could change for autofocus. And I'm going to use tracking sensitivity as the example here. You had choices of either locked on all the way up to responsive, and maybe 2 or 3, 4 steps in between there. And what that meant was when the autofocus system locked on the bird, got on the bird, and it's flying, if something else came into the frame, like the bird for a second flew behind a tree, if you had it set up on the responsive side, it should switch to the tree instantly and then back to the bird when it comes off the other side. If you have it on the locked on side of things down here, when that bird passes behind the tree, it should not refocus on the tree. It should stay on the bird. Okay. Those settings in the past didn't really do much. You could have things set wrong, completely wrong almost, for the type of scenario you were shooting, and it would still kind of work for you. If you do that now, it will not work for you because these settings now really do change the behavior of your autofocus system. If you have it set on responsive, it's going to be responsive. It's going to be all over the place. Whatever that autofocus point is on, or whatever it thinks is the subject, it's going to grab it. If it's down on locked on and it locks on the bird and other things come into the frame, more than likely it's not going to budge an inch. It's going to stay on the bird. So with autofocus and a lot of other settings in cameras now, if you don't understand the systems and the settings and you don't pay attention to them and you don't set them up right correctly for your scenario that you're shooting, birds in flight in this example, you could be making things very, very difficult on you. I've had a lot of clients say, Ron, you say the R5's autofocus system is so good, it stinks. I can't get it to do anything for me. It's horrible. I get together with them and I go through their autofocus menus and help them set up their cameras, and they've got things kind of wonky in there for what they're trying to do, birds in flight, for this example, let's say. And I help them set it up, and they go out and they do have a lot better luck, it seems. And so the point here is these settings matter. These cameras are complex now. There's a lot of different things that you can set a lot of different parameters, so pay attention to them. Stuck in the mud. How many of you shooting your mirrorless cameras now? Shot digital SLRs, now we're shooting mirrorless. When you put your autofocus point on something and it couldn't focus, it would cycle back and forth until it found something, hopefully your subject, and it would grab it. But then if you moved it off a little bit and you hit the half press of the shutter button or the back button, whatever you use to initiate your autofocus, it would refocus. Mirrorless cameras and their autofocus systems are different. They're very different. And I'm not going to go into all of that now, but they tend to get stuck on what they like as their subject more often. And that's can be a bad thing. You can be pumping that back button or half pressing and say, no, I don't want the background. I want the freaking bird on the tree right there. It's sitting right in front of you. Why won't you? I've got the center autofocus, you know, it's not going there. And you have to find something else much closer or further away, get on that, get it to autofocus on that, get back on the bird, and then hopefully it'll grab the bird. This is something that seems to has come along with mirrorless autofocus systems. It happens much more often. And so this is a bad thing, and you have to change how you think about your autofocus system and how you set it up. The way I set up my Canon R5, one of the great things about these cameras nowadays is you can change what the buttons do. Reprogramming your buttons and dials to your liking is there for you now. I have 3 back buttons set up on my R5. There's 3 back buttons that my thumb can reach, and they're all set up for different autofocus methods. So I can go to 3 different autofocus methods in a split second. The far right one, which is the autofocus select point select button, is set to spot autofocus, almost specifically for that reason. When it gets stuck, the one autofocus method that seems to unstick it is to use spot. Put the spot on the thing that you're trying to focus on and hit that, it'll focus on it. Then you can go back to eye detect with tracking or zone or whatever you wanted to use in the first place. So these cameras can get stuck in the mud sometimes with regards to autofocus. They behave a little bit differently. So don't let that frustrate you. There are ways around it. That's my point here. But that is one of the bad things about autofocus systems. The R3, I've only played with it for 1 morning so far. It doesn't seem to get stuck as much. I don't know if that's really true yet, but we'll find out as time goes along. They may be working on that a little bit with the algorithms and stuff. Let's talk about stabilization. This one will be quick. The good. IBIS and IS now. IBIS, in-body image stabilization. IS, just like lens-based stabilization. Canon calls it image stabilization. Sony calls it steady shot. Nikon calls it vibration reduction. It doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. It all used to be lens-based for the most part on the cameras we use for birds in flight a lot of times. Now you've got in-body and lens-based. And with Canon systems, they work together. All right. That comes to the first point here, strength. The strength of stabilization and stops or steps or whatever you want to call it, up to 8 stops of stabilization available to you now. That is unbelievable. You can handhold 600 millimeters at 1/30th of a second. And as long as your subject isn't moving, you can get sharp images. That is just, that should blow your mind. It blows mine anyway. So the strength of this is a great thing. And you're thinking, well, you know, it is, but we're talking about birds in flight here. So how much can you really take advantage of image stabilization for birds in flight? Because we're generally shooting high shutter speeds for birds in flight, upwards of 1/1000th of a second. I like to get as fast as I can get most of the time, up to 1/8000th of a second even, especially for kingfishers and things, you know, really fast stuff. So then, you know, the IBIS, the stabilization really doesn't do you a whole lot. That shutter speed is helping you. It's stopping the movement and all that kind of stuff. So the image stabilization isn't all that important. Is it? Well, that gets to the next point, a stable viewfinder. On Canon cameras, anyway, you've got multiple modes. And I know this is the case for Sony, and I know it's the case for Nikon as well. They have mode 1, 2, and 3 on a lot of the lenses now. And that actually helps, and it controls the IBIS in Canon cameras as well. It's all done by the lenses in Canon anyway. You don't want to be on mode 1, but for birds in flight, mode 2 is for panning. Mode 3 is for erratic subjects. The cool thing about mode 2, though, is that you not only get the stabilization for your shot, it stabilizes your viewfinder. So it makes it easier for you to stay on a flying subject, a fast moving subject, because all that jittery that you're doing with your hands and stuff is stabilized, not only for the autofocus, for the bird, for you shooting, but for the viewfinder. So it makes it easier for you to stay on a subject. That's a great thing. Stable autofocus. Guess what? If the view through your viewfinder is more stable for you, it's more stable to the autofocus system. What does that mean? It means your autofocus system can do a better job of getting an accurate lock on your subject and getting really good, accurate autofocus. You're going to get more sharp shots. So shoot mode 2. Shoot whatever mode stabilization you have that is for panning. It can help even at high shutter speeds. Okay, so that's the points. That's the good stuff for stabilization. I guess that means there's some bad stuff too. Whoops, back. There we go. Mode matters. Oh, come on. Technology. Oh, don't do that. Why does it keep advancing? Mode matters. Like I said, your settings for your autofocus system matters. Well, I kind of just alluded to the fact that there's different modes for stabilization as well, and they matter. Right now, if I tried to shoot a bird in flight on mode 1 with my Canon R5 or my Canon R3, good luck. Because mode 1 is for static subjects. It's going to stabilize any movement that it senses. That stabilization system, if you're doing that, it's going to stabilize everything. So if you try to pan with a bird, good luck. It's going to try to, you're panning this way, it's going to be jerking you backwards saying, I'm trying to stabilize this, you're moving too much and I can't do it, but it's going to try. And it's going to make it very difficult for you to stay on that subject. You put it to mode 2, completely different. Mode 3 doesn't do anything until you actually start taking pictures, and then it'll stabilize things. That's why it's for erratic subjects. So mode matters. I get so many people say, I can't pan today. I just can't pan today. And I'll look over at their lens and it's on mode 1. They forgot, we had a bird in a bush or something and we were shooting that and they put it to mode 1. They forgot to take it off and we're shooting birds in flight now and they can't pan with anything. They can't stay on the bird. It'll also ruin your images. Even if you can stay on the bird and it's the elements of the lens are moving and now your sensor's moving and to try to stabilize things. So it will blur your images in weird ways if you're on mode 1 when you're trying to pan. So mode does matter. So okay. So we're to the ugly of all of this. And I didn't have an ugly for every aspect of this. The ugly thing that I see with the advancements in cameras technology, lens technology, is you're holding a very complex computer in your hands now. This isn't film anymore, obviously. When we shot film, those of you who did shoot film, you didn't have to worry about too much. You had to get the film in the camera and get it wound. Then you had to basically set your aperture and your shutter speed and that's in film speed, and that's it. You went out and took pictures. Not anymore. As you can see, as I went through here, there's things that you have to set up in your camera, and these settings matter these days. And the ugly thing is people are getting overwhelmed with the complexity of their cameras. They're getting overwhelmed with all of the settings that they have to get right to maximize what these cameras can do for them. And not only that, keep these cameras from making it much more difficult to get the images they want in the scenarios that they want. They're getting frustrated. And I see it all the time. And I have to tell, they're losing sight of the forest for the trees. They're watching videos all the time. They're reading. They're spending so much time trying to figure out how to set up their cameras correctly. They're losing the fun aspect of photography is going away for these people. And I have to try to, I try to get them back into the thinking that it doesn't have to be complex. Yes, some settings matter, but there's, on a lot of those settings, there's a middle ground, right? There's a middle setting to the autofocus sense, tracking sensitivity. There's a middle setting for all of these things for the most part. So don't let the technology ruin the fun of photography. I'm seeing this with more and more people, more now than ever before, because of the customization that's available on cameras, because of all of the settings that are available in these cameras. It's really, getting to some people, and they're losing, the fun of photography is not there for them anymore. And I'm trying to get some of these people back, into understanding that, yes, it's complex. Yes, you have to know more about your cameras than ever before to get the most out of them, but there are middle settings. You can get back to just going out and shooting images, and don't ever let technology, technology is supposed to make things better. And like you see, there's good sides, and most of what's happened with technology is really good when it comes to bird and flight photography, but there are some bad things, and this one really ugly thing, I think. And because that's the worst thing that can ever happen, is that people stop taking pictures. They stop going out and enjoying nature and taking bird pictures because they're just so flustered with their camera systems. So anyway, I'm not going to go into too much more, except to put my name up here and all this other kind of stuff. So yeah, I wanted to leave time for questions, and I know I don't know, what time is it? Yeah, 11:30. So, about an hour. Was that an hour? Did I talk for an hour? I didn't talk for an hour, did I? So anyway, so that's it.